Okay, and so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk a little bit more about specifically the pelvis. We've talked about the pelvic girdle, but now there's some things that we have to talk about with the pelvis. First, what I'd like to do is I'd like to point out to you where each of these features are. So keep this page up, and I'm going to switch to the webcam only view because I think it'll be a better view for you. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a model that is showing part of the pelvis. So just as a reminder, the pelvic girdle is just going to be one hip bone and the other hip bone. The difference between pelvic girdle and pelvis is that the pelvis includes both of these hip bones as well as the sacrum. So let me show you this way, as well as the sacrum, okay, and the coccyx. Okay, so that little point down there is the coccyx. Okay, so whereas the pelvic girdle is just appendicular skeleton, because we've added in sacrum and coccyx, that means that the pelvis is a mix of axial and appendicular. Now, there's a thing called the true pelvis and the false pelvis. Okay, so the true pelvis is going to be this area down in here. Okay, so all of this down in here is going to be true pelvis, and it's considered true pelvis because anything down in here is actually encased in the bones. Okay, now this up here, things that sit in this part of the pelvis, this is considered false pelvis because there's bony support along this backside, but this whole front portion here, and if we look at it sideways, okay, this whole front portion here has no bone in front of it. Okay, it's going to be muscles and different things like that. But only this part down here is actually going to be encased with bone all around it. Okay. Now, some different terms that I want to point out on the bone because I think it might be a little bit easier. One, we have what's called the arcuate line, and that's going to be just along the hip bone, and it's going to run right in this area across here. Okay, so that's the arcuate line. Now the pelvic brim is very close. The pelvic brim is actually going to be this circle right here. Okay, so arcuate line is just this portion along the hip bone, also called the os coxa, but the pelvic brim is this entire region around here. Now this right here is really the boundary between true pelvis and false pelvis. Everything above the pelvic brim, above the arcuate line, is going to be false pelvis. Everything below it is true pelvis. Okay. Now this whole area where things actually go from false into true is called the pelvic inlet. Okay. And then if we look on this side, down on the bottom portion here, okay, this down here, okay, that area, okay, we've got our coccyx, we've got our ischial spines that mark the boundary, okay, and then we've got the ischial tuberosities going up into the pubic rami and the pubic symphysis. So that area here where things would come out is going to be the pelvic outlet. Okay, so pelvic inlet up top into the true pelvis, pelvic outlet going out of it. And actually measuring how big the pelvic inlet and outlet are really important whenever physicians are looking at, or midwives are looking at childbirth, because you've got to be able to have the baby's head fit through the inlet and the outlet, and if it's just not possible, then they may recommend a C-section. Okay. Now, the top of the false pelvis is actually going to be right here at the iliac crest. Okay, so this boundary right across here would be the top of the false pelvis. So false pelvis goes from iliac crest down to this pelvic brim. Okay, and then true pelvis goes from the pelvic brim or pelvic inlet down to the pelvic outlet. Okay, along the floor here is going to be the perineum. Okay, and there's going to be a lot of what's called perineal muscles that are going to be right across this pelvic outlet area, right across the perineum, and those are actually going to help support and keep those organs and different things supported and in place. Okay, that are in the true pelvis. Okay. The only other thing I'd like to point out here is that we do have this thing called the pelvic angle, and the pelvic angle is the angle that runs between here and here. And so one thing that you're going to notice that there are differences between men and women and how close this angle is, whether it's far apart or those bones are close together. That's one of the big differences that we see between the male pelvis and the female pelvis. So those are some of the differences here that I wanted to show you on an actual model that's put together. I think it's a little bit easier to see that here than in your textbook. Okay, and so here in the rest of your homework activity are some labeling exercises to help you get familiar with these terms on different images in the textbook. And there's also this activity to help you start thinking about the differences between the male and the female skeleton. If you look in your books on page 253, there's actually an entire page here that goes through the differences between males and females, and it particularly focuses on the pelvis because this is one of the main places where we begin to see a difference between males and females, is that pelvis. Also, I want to point out in your note packet that there is a section to go through the pelvis. Okay, and so you should think about here, the pelvis contains which bones? Well, it's going to contain the ilium, the ischium, the pubis, those are called the os coxa, and then also the sacrum and the coccyx. And so that means it's a mix, like we said, axial and appendicular skeleton. The function of the pelvis is to support and protect the organs of that pelvic cavity. So the boundary of the true pelvis, at the top, you're going to have the arcuate line / pelvic brim / pelvic inlet, and at the bottom you're going to have the pelvic outlet. Okay, and the false pelvis, at the top we're going to have the iliac crest. Okay, and that's going to run to that arcuate line, pelvic brim, pelvic inlet. And then this I'm not going to fill in for you, but you can look at that page I showed you in your textbook and just go through there. Make sure you're not just copying down words on the page without thinking. Make sure that you can put it in your own words and really think about what is going to be the difference between the male and female pelvis, and do I understand as I'm writing these words down what it's actually referring to. Okay? And so that is the pelvis.